Let me ask you something. What happens when a vague order written in haste meets aristocratic pride and mutual hatred between commanders? What happens when 670 cavalrymen, the finest light cavalry in the British Army, receive orders to charge directly into the concentrated fire of an entire Russian artillery battery positioned at the end of a valley with more Russian guns on both sides? What do you do when you know the order is suicide, when every instinct screams that this is wrong, but military discipline and honor demand obedience? The answer came on October 25, 1854, in a valley outside Sevastopol in the Crimea, during a battle that should have been a footnote, but instead became the most famous military disaster in British history. This is the story of the charge of the Light Brigade, 670 men who rode into certain death because of a communication failure, aristocratic incompetence, and a rigid command structure that valued obedience over sense. This isn't about heroic cavalry saving the day. This is about how organizational dysfunction, personal animosity between commanders, and one catastrophically unclear order killed hundreds of men in 20 minutes for absolutely no strategic gain. No glory, no romanticism. Just the facts about how the British Army sent its light cavalry on a suicide mission, watched them get slaughtered, and then immortalized the disaster in poetry. If this story teaches you something about command failure and the cost of military incompetence, hit that like button and drop a comment. We are here to understand what actually happened, not to celebrate futile charges. Now let's go back to October 1854, to a war that made no sense, being fought by armies that barely understood why they were there, and watch how everything went wrong in the worst possible way. The Crimean War was a confused mess from the beginning. Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire were fighting Russia over religious disputes in the Holy Land, declining Ottoman power, and British and French fears of Russian expansion. The actual reasons were complicated, the diplomatic maneuvering was Byzantine, and the result was a war where nobody had clear objectives and everyone was making it up as they went along. The war began in 1853. By 1854, British and French forces had landed in the Crimea, the peninsula in the Black Sea, with the goal of capturing the Russian naval base at Sevastopol. The campaign was a disaster. The British and French armies were poorly supplied, badly led, and unprepared for a major land war. Cholera and dysentery were killing more men than combat. The supply system was broken. Soldiers were dying from inadequate food, clothing, and medical care. This was the war that Florence Nightingale would make famous by exposing the horrific conditions in British military hospitals. By October 1854, the Allies had been besieging Sevastopol for weeks with minimal progress. The British Army was positioned around the port of Balaclava, which served as their supply base. The Russians, trying to break the siege, decided to attack the British positions around Balaclava and cut off the Allied supply line. On October 25th, the Russians launched their offensive. This is the Battle of Balaclava, which would include 3 separate cavalry actions: the charge of the Heavy Brigade, which was successful, the charge of the Light Brigade, which was catastrophic, and the stand of the 93rd Highland Regiment, which became known as the Thin Red Line. We are focused on the Light Brigade, but you need to understand the context. The British cavalry in the Crimea was divided into 2 brigades. The Heavy Brigade consisted of large men on large horses, designed for shock combat, charging into enemy formations and breaking them through sheer weight. The Light Brigade consisted of smaller, faster horses and lighter equipment, designed for reconnaissance, pursuit, skirmishing, and screening. Light cavalry was not supposed to charge prepared positions. They were supposed to exploit success, chase broken enemies, harass flanks, not attack artillery head-on. The Light Brigade at Balaclava consisted of 5 regiments: the 4th Light Dragoons, the 8th Hussars, the 11th Hussars, the 13th Light Dragoons, and the 17th Lancers. Total strength was 670 men. They were commanded by Major General James Brudenell, the 7th Earl of Cardigan. Cardigan was 57 years old, wealthy, arrogant, and generally hated by his subordinate officers and men. He'd purchased his commission, as was common for aristocrats, and had no real combat experience. He was brave, there's no question about his personal courage, but he was also rigid, obsessed with regulations and appearances, and completely unable to think independently. He followed orders to the letter, no matter how stupid those orders were. The cavalry division, which included both the heavy and light brigades, was commanded by Lieutenant General George Bingham, the 3rd Earl of Lucan. Lucan was Cardigan's brother-in-law. They despised each other. They'd been feuding for years over family matters, money, and military affairs. Lucan thought Cardigan was an incompetent dandy. Cardigan thought Lucan was a vindictive bully. They communicated only when absolutely necessary and undermined each other whenever possible. This mutual hatred would contribute directly to the disaster. The overall British commander was Field Marshal Lord Raglan, 66 years old, a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars where he'd served as the Duke of Wellington's aide and lost his right arm at Waterloo. Raglan was a decent administrator and a terrible field commander. He was indecisive, out of touch with modern warfare, and prone to issuing vague orders that assumed his subordinates understood his intentions. He habitually referred to the enemy as the French because he'd spent his entire military career fighting France and couldn't adjust to the fact that France was now an ally. This was the command structure that would send the Light Brigade to its death. A supreme commander who was vague and out of touch, a division commander and brigade commander who hated each other, and a rigid adherence to orders no matter how suicidal. Now let's talk about the battle. On the morning of October 25th, Russian forces attacked the British positions on the Causeway Heights, a ridge overlooking the valley where the Light Brigade was positioned. The Russians overran several redoubts, small fortifications manned by Turkish troops and British artillery, and captured the guns. This was a problem. The British couldn't allow the Russians to hold those positions and threaten Balaclava. Lord Raglan, observing the battle from a high position several hundred feet above the valley, could see the entire battlefield. He could see Russian forces beginning to move the captured British guns away from the redoubts. Losing those guns would be a humiliation. British artillery captured by the enemy was a stain on the army's honor. Raglan decided the guns had to be recaptured immediately. He wrote an order to Lord Lucan, commanding the cavalry division. The order read, "Lord Raglan wishes the cavalry to advance rapidly to the front, follow the enemy, and try to prevent the enemy carrying away the guns. Troop horse artillery may accompany. French cavalry is on your left. Immediate." This order was vague. Which guns? The ones on the Causeway Heights that the Russians had just captured, or Russian guns somewhere else? What did "advance rapidly to the front" mean? What direction? Raglan, from his elevated position, could see exactly what he meant. He meant the cavalry should advance up the Causeway Heights and recapture the British guns the Russians were hauling away from the redoubts. But Lucan, down in the valley, couldn't see those guns. From his position, the Causeway Heights blocked his view. He couldn't see what Raglan was referring to. Lucan read the order and was confused. Advance where? Prevent which guns from being carried away? He could see Russian cavalry and infantry in several directions, but no guns being moved. The order made no sense. Raglan, frustrated that Lucan wasn't moving immediately, sent his aide-de-camp, Captain Louis Nolan, to deliver the order personally and ensure it was obeyed. Nolan was 36 years old, an experienced cavalry officer and contemptuous of the British cavalry leadership. He thought Lucan and Cardigan were incompetent aristocrats who'd bought their ranks and had no business commanding cavalry. He was probably right, but his contempt would contribute to the disaster. Nolan rode down from Raglan's position to where Lucan waited with the cavalry division. He handed Lucan the written order. Lucan read it again, still confused. He asked Nolan, "Where are we to advance to?" Nolan, frustrated and contemptuous, gestured vaguely with his arm toward the far end of the valley and said, There, my lord, is your enemy. There are your guns. This was the critical moment. Lucan looked in the direction Nolan indicated. At the far end of the valley, about a mile away, was a Russian artillery battery of 12 guns positioned across the valley floor. On either side of the valley, on the Fedyukin heights to the left and the causeway heights to the right, were additional Russian guns and infantry. This was the Valley of Death, a mile-long killing ground with artillery on 3 sides. Lucan assumed, based on Nolan's gesture and the phrasing of the order, that Raglan wanted him to attack that Russian battery at the end of the valley. This was insane. Attacking artillery head-on with light cavalry through a mile of open ground under fire from guns on 3 sides was suicide, but the order said immediate. Raglan wanted this done now. Lucan didn't like it, didn't understand it, but he was a professional soldier. He followed orders. He turned to Cardigan, who commanded the Light Brigade, and relayed the order. Cardigan's response was immediate. Certainly, sir, but allow me to point out to you that the Russians have a battery in the valley on our front and batteries and riflemen on both sides. Lucan replied, I know it, but Lord Raglan will have it. We have no choice but to obey. Cardigan, for once in his life, had correctly assessed a tactical situation. This was suicide, but he was even more rigid about following orders than Lucan. If the order was to charge, he would charge. He would lead from the front, because that's what a cavalry commander did, and he would die if necessary, because dying while following orders was honorable. He returned to the Light Brigade and gave the order to prepare to advance. 670 men formed up in 3 lines. The 13th Light Dragoons and 17th Lancers in the first line, about 300 men. The 11th Hussars in the second line, about 200 men. The 4th Light Dragoons and 8th Hussars in the third line, about 170 men. Cardigan positioned himself at the front, alone, several horse lengths ahead of the first line. Behind the Light Brigade, the Heavy Brigade was ordered to follow in support, but they moved slowly and would not keep up. At approximately 11 a.m., Cardigan drew his sword and ordered, "The brigade will advance. Walk, march, trot." The Light Brigade began moving down the valley toward the Russian guns a mile away. The pace was controlled. Walk, then trot. Not a gallop yet. Preserve the horses' energy. They'd need it. Captain Nolan, who delivered the order, attached himself to the charge. He rode with the 17th Lancers in the first line. As the brigade began moving, he suddenly spurred his horse forward, riding diagonally across the front of the formation, shouting and waving his sword. Nobody knows what he was trying to do. Some historians think he realized the charge was going in the wrong direction, that Lucan had misunderstood the order, and he was trying to redirect them toward the causeway heights. Others think he was just caught up in the excitement. We'll never know, because within seconds of starting his ride, a Russian shell exploded near him. A piece of shrapnel hit Nolan in the chest, piercing his heart. He was dead instantly, but his body remained upright in the saddle, his arm raised with the sword, his horse carrying him through the brigade lines before he finally fell. The first casualty of the charge was the man who delivered the order that caused it. The Light Brigade continued forward. At about 300 yards from the start, Russian artillery on the causeway heights to their right opened fire. Round-shot, heavy iron balls fired from cannons began plowing through the lines. A single round shot could kill or wound multiple men and horses. The formation maintained discipline, closed ranks when men fell, and continued forward. At about 500 yards, Russian artillery on the Fedyukin heights to their left joined in. Now they were taking fire from both sides as well as from the battery in front. Shells exploded overhead, spraying shrapnel. Canister rounds, essentially giant shotgun blasts of metal balls, tore through horses and men. The noise was overwhelming. The screams of wounded horses, the explosions of shells, the shouts of officers trying to maintain formation. Cardigan, riding alone at the front, was miraculously untouched. He maintained a steady pace, not looking back, trusting his brigade to follow. Men were dying every second now. Horses were collapsing, throwing their riders. Riderless horses were panicking, crashing into the formation. But the brigade kept going. This is the insane part. They were being slaughtered, and they kept riding forward at a controlled pace because those were the orders. At about 800 yards, Cardigan ordered the pace increased to a canter, still not a full gallop. Preserve the horses, close the distance. More men fell. The first line, which had started with about 300 men, was down to maybe 200. The second and third lines were suffering as well, but the formation was still intact. This was professional cavalry, trained for years, disciplined under fire. At about 1,000 yards, with just a few hundred yards remaining to the Russian battery, Cardigan ordered the gallop. Now they charged at full speed, covering the last distance as fast as possible. The Russian artillery switched to canister at close range, blasting directly into the charging cavalry. Men and horses were blown apart. The formation started to fragment. Individual riders pulled ahead or fell behind. The lines blurred into a mass of charging cavalry, and then they hit the Russian guns. Cardigan reached the battery first, riding between two cannons. The Russian gunners, who'd been firing until the cavalry was on top of them, abandoned their guns and ran. Cardigan rode through the battery and out the other side, alone. He looked back and saw chaos. The remnants of the Light Brigade, maybe 300 men out of the 670 who'd started, were swarming over the Russian guns, cutting down gunners, trying to spike the cannons, fighting Russian cavalry that had moved in to protect the battery. Behind them, the valley floor was littered with dead and wounded men and horses. The charge had reached its objective. They'd hit the Russian battery, but they couldn't hold it. They were a few hundred light cavalry, surrounded by thousands of Russian infantry and cavalry, with no support, no reinforcements, and no way to get the captured guns back. Russian cavalry counterattacked. Lancers, hussars, and Cossacks swarmed the British position. The fighting became a melee, swords and lances, point-blank pistol shots, horses colliding. Some British cavalrymen tried to spike the Russian guns, driving metal spikes into the touch holes to make them unusable, but they didn't have time. Others fought desperately just to survive. Lord Cardigan, having ridden through the battery, continued forward another 100 yards before realizing he was completely alone. He turned around and saw the fight at the battery. He also saw Russian cavalry between him and his brigade. He made the calculated decision that trying to rejoin his men would get him killed or captured, and a brigade commander captured would be a propaganda victory for the Russians. He rode back along the edge of the valley, avoiding the main fight, and returned to British lines. This decision would later be criticized as abandonment, but tactically it made sense. He couldn't command from the middle of a melee, and getting captured served no purpose. The survivors at the Russian battery realized they couldn't hold. Russian reinforcements were arriving by the hundreds. The Light Brigade began to retreat, riding back down the valley the way they'd come, still under fire from the guns on the heights. This is when the Heavy Brigade was supposed to support them, covering their retreat, but the Heavy Brigade had advanced slowly and was too far back. The Light Brigade survivors rode back through the same killing ground, taking more casualties. Some men, wounded or with exhausted horses, were captured. Others fell and were left behind. The remnants of the brigade staggered back to British lines in small groups, battered, shocked, many wounded. The entire action, from the start of the charge to the return of the survivors, took about 20 minutes. Let's talk about casualties. Of the 670 men who charged, approximately 110 were killed, 160 were wounded, and about 50 were captured. Nearly half the brigade was casualty. 375 horses were killed. The survivors returned in a state of shock. Men wept openly. Horses stood with their heads down, exhausted, covered in blood. Officers tried to count who'd survived, who was missing, who was dead. Cardigan returned shortly after the last survivors and immediately went to his yacht, where he'd been living rather than in a tent with his men, and had a bath and a bottle of champagne. This callousness would become infamous. His men had just been slaughtered, and he was bathing. Later that day, when French General Pierre Bosquet, observing the charge, made his famous comment, "C'est magnifique, mais ce n'est pas la guerre, c'est de la folie." It is magnificent, but it is not war, it is madness. That's the French perspective on the charge of the Light Brigade. Magnificent courage, absolute madness. Bosquet understood immediately that this had been a catastrophic blunder, not a heroic necessity. So what actually happened? How did this occur? Let's break down the chain of failures. First, Lord Raglan wrote a vague order that assumed his subordinates could see what he could see and understand what he meant. He didn't specify which guns, which direction, or what the actual objective was. He wrote "advance rapidly to the front" without defining the front. Second, he sent the order via Captain Nolan, who despised the cavalry commanders and delivered the order with contempt rather than clarification. When Lucan asked for clarification, Nolan's vague gesture toward the Russian battery at the end of the valley led Lucan to completely misunderstand the objective. Third, Lucan, receiving an order he thought was insane, followed it anyway because it came from the Supreme Commander and was marked immediate. He passed the order to Cardigan without additional clarification or modification. Fourth, Cardigan, recognizing the order was suicidal, followed it anyway because that's what orders meant. Obedience to orders, no matter how stupid, was the foundation of military discipline. Fifth, the mutual hatred between Lucan and Cardigan meant there was no trust, no communication beyond the bare minimum, no willingness to question or discuss the order. If they'd been able to work together, one of them might have sent an officer back to Raglan asking for clarification. Instead, they just executed what they thought they'd been told to do. Sixth, the rigid British class and military system that put aristocrats with purchased commissions in command of professional soldiers meant that strategic and tactical competence was secondary to social status. Raglan, Lucan, and Cardigan were in command because of who they were, not because of their military skill. Seventh, the order was marked immediate, which created pressure to act without taking time to understand or question. Raglan wanted instant action, and instant action meant no time for clarification. All these factors combined to send 670 men into a mile-long valley under fire from 3 directions to attack a battery they had no hope of capturing or holding. It was organizational dysfunction leading to catastrophic tactical failure. Now let's talk about what happened afterward, because the response to this disaster is almost as interesting as the disaster itself. Initially, there was confusion about what had actually happened. British officers tried to understand why the Light Brigade had charged the wrong objective. Raglan was furious, believing Lucan had disobeyed orders. Lucan insisted he'd followed the order as delivered. Cardigan claimed he'd followed Lucan's directions. Everyone blamed everyone else. The question of who was responsible became a political and military scandal. When news of the charge reached Britain, the public reaction was mixed. The Times correspondent William Howard Russell had been present at the battle and wrote a detailed account describing the heroism of the charge, but also the stupidity of it. His reports shocked the British public. How could the army waste the cavalry so recklessly? Other newspapers picked up the story, and suddenly the charge of the Light Brigade was national news. Then Alfred Lord Tennyson, the poet laureate, wrote his poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade. Published in December 1854, just weeks after the battle, the poem transformed the disaster into a legend. Half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death rode the 600. Tennyson's poem focused on the courage and obedience of the soldiers, not on the incompetence that sent them to die. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. The poem celebrated blind obedience to orders, turning a catastrophic command failure into a tale of heroic duty. The poem was wildly popular. It was memorized by schoolchildren, recited at public events, turned into the defining image of the Crimean War. The reality that this was a senseless waste of life caused by vague orders and command dysfunction was buried under the narrative of heroic sacrifice. The British Army conducted an investigation. Lord Raglan blamed Lucan for misunderstanding the order. Lucan blamed Nolan for giving incorrect directions and blamed Raglan for issuing vague orders. Cardigan was mostly exonerated because he'd simply followed Lucan's orders. Nobody was court-martialed. Nobody was officially punished. Lucan was quietly relieved of command and sent home, but he wasn't formally blamed. Raglan remained in command until his death from dysentery in 1855. The investigation concluded that the charge was a tragic misunderstanding, an accident of war, rather than criminal incompetence. This was a whitewash. What the investigation should have concluded was that the British command system was broken, that aristocratic officers with purchased commissions were unfit to command, that the lack of staff training and clear doctrine for writing and transmitting orders was killing soldiers, and that the entire military culture needed reform. Instead, the charge was romanticized as an example of courage and duty. Let's talk about the survivors. The men who rode through the valley and came back were traumatized. Many suffered from what we'd now call PTSD. They'd watched friends die, had horses shot out from under them, survived by pure chance while men next to them were killed. Some survivors became celebrities, touring Britain giving lectures about the charge. Others withdrew, unable to speak about it. The Light Brigade was rebuilt with replacements and continued to serve in the Crimea, but it never recovered its strength or morale. The regiments that had charged at Balaclava were shadows of their former selves. The captured British soldiers, about 50 men taken prisoner by the Russians, were eventually repatriated in prisoner exchanges. They reported decent treatment by Russian forces, which was unusual for the era. The Russians respected the courage of the charge even as they recognized its futility. One survivor, Sergeant Major Lois Smith of the 11th Hussars, wrote years later, "We went because we were ordered to go, and we did not know what we were doing. It was a gallant charge, but it should never have been made." That's the voice of experience. A man who survived and understood it was waste. The horses deserve mention. 375 horses were killed in 20 minutes. These were cavalry mounts, trained for years, expensive, irreplaceable. The British Army struggled with horse procurement for the rest of the war. The dead horses in the valley were left to rot. Visitors to Balaclava months later reported the valley still stank of decomposition. The myth of the charge spread beyond Britain. In Russia, the charge was remembered as an example of British courage bordering on insanity. Russian soldiers who'd faced the charge told stories about the cavalrymen who'd ridden through impossible fire to reach the guns. It became part of Russian military law as well as British. In France, the charge was seen as proof that the British were brave but poorly led, which fit French stereotypes about their allies. The French army used the charge as a cautionary tale in their military academies, an example of what happens when orders are unclear and subordinates are afraid to question them. In the decades after the Crimean War, the charge of the Light Brigade became the most famous cavalry action in history, overshadowing successful cavalry charges, brilliant tactical victories, everything. Why? Because it combined heroism with tragedy, courage with stupidity, obedience with waste. It was the perfect story for an era that was starting to question blind military obedience but still romanticized martial courage. Now let's talk about what the charge actually accomplished. Strategically, nothing. The Light Brigade didn't recapture the British guns on the Causeway Heights, which is what Raglan actually wanted. They attacked the wrong objective. They reached the Russian battery at the end of the valley, but they couldn't hold it or disable the guns. They inflicted minimal casualties on the Russians. They didn't break Russian morale or disrupt Russian operations. The Battle of Balaclava continued after the charge with no significant change to the overall situation. Tactically, the charge demonstrated that disciplined cavalry could charge through artillery fire and reach their objective, but at catastrophic cost and with no ability to exploit success. The lesson should have been, Don't send light cavalry against prepared artillery positions. Instead, the lesson learned was, British cavalry are incredibly brave, which was already known. The real impact of the charge was on British public opinion and military culture. The disaster, combined with reports of supply failures, disease, and incompetent leadership, turned public opinion against the war and against the military establishment. The Crimean War became synonymous with waste and incompetence. Florence Nightingale's work reforming military hospitals, William Howard Russell's war reporting exposing command failures, and the charge of the Light Brigade became the three pillars of a narrative that the British military system was broken and needed reform. That reform eventually came. The purchase of commissions was abolished in 1871, meaning officers had to earn their ranks rather than buy them. Staff training was improved. Doctrine for writing and transmitting orders was developed. The military became more professional, less aristocratic. In that sense, the Light Brigade's sacrifice contributed to long-term improvement, but that's cold comfort for the men who died in the valley. Let's also address the myth versus reality. Tennyson's poem created an image of the charge as a glorious, willing sacrifice. The reality was more complex. Many of the men who charged did so reluctantly, knowing it was suicide, but following orders because that's what soldiers did. Some were angry, feeling abandoned by their commanders. Others were fatalistic, accepting that they'd probably die but hoping they'd survive. A few were genuinely enthusiastic, caught up in the excitement of a cavalry charge. There was no single emotional state, no unified feeling of glorious sacrifice. There was fear, anger, confusion, courage, and resignation, all mixed together. The poem also obscured the role of command failure. "Someone had blundered" is the only acknowledgement in Tennyson's verse that this was a mistake, and it's vague enough to avoid assigning blame. The poem celebrates the soldiers' obedience without questioning why they were ordered to charge in the first place. This created a cultural narrative that following orders, no matter how stupid, is the highest virtue. That narrative has done enormous damage over the past century and a half, used to justify all sorts of military and civilian atrocities committed just following orders. The truth is more nuanced. Soldiers should follow orders. That's essential for military function. But commanders have a responsibility to give orders that make sense, and subordinates have a responsibility to question orders that are clearly suicidal or criminal. The charge of the Light Brigade was a failure at every level of command. Raglan failed to give clear orders, Nolan failed to clarify them, Lucan failed to question them, Cardigan failed to refuse them, and 670 men paid the price. Now let's talk about comparisons. The charge of the Light Brigade is often held up as the archetypal example of military disaster caused by command failure. But is it the worst? No, it's not even close. At the Battle of the Somme in 1916, British forces suffered 60,000 casualties on the first day, most in the first hour, for minimal gain. At Gallipoli in 1915, an entire campaign was bungled through poor planning and execution, resulting in hundreds of thousands of casualties. At Isandlwana in 1879, 1,400 British soldiers were killed by Zulu warriors because the commander failed to form a defensive perimeter. The Light Brigade lost 330 men killed and wounded. Terrible, tragic, wasteful, but small compared to other disasters. So why is it so famous? Because of the poetry, the narrative, and the stark clarity of the mistake. It's easy to understand what went wrong. A vague order, a miscommunication, a charge into the wrong valley. It's simple, dramatic, and fundamentally avoidable. The Somme was a systemic failure involving millions of men and months of planning. Gallipoli was a strategic disaster involving multiple nations and complex logistics. The Light Brigade was 20 minutes of confusion and courage that could have been prevented if any one of several people had done their job better. That clarity makes it memorable. It also makes it useful as a teaching tool. Military academies around the world use the charge of the Light Brigade as a case study in command and communication. What happens when orders are unclear? What happens when subordinates are afraid to question orders? What happens when personal animosity between commanders prevents effective coordination? The charge answers all these questions in one dramatic, tragic lesson. The other reason it's famous is the survivors. Because the casualty rate was roughly 50%, about 340 men came home and told their stories. They wrote memoirs, gave interviews, attended reunions. The charge remained a living memory for decades, kept alive by men who'd been there. Compare this to battles where entire units were wiped out with no survivors to tell the story. The Light Brigade had survivors, and those survivors made sure the charge was remembered. Let me address one more aspect, the Russian perspective. We've focused on British command failures, but what did the Russians think? Russian commanders at Balaclava were shocked when they saw the Light Brigade charging toward their guns. They assumed the cavalry was the vanguard of a larger attack, that British infantry and artillery would follow. When they realized the cavalry was alone, with no support, they were confused. Why would the British send light cavalry against artillery with no support? Some Russian officers thought it was a desperate last-ditch attack, that the British were on the verge of collapse, and this was a suicide charge to buy time. Others thought it was a feint, meant to distract from an attack elsewhere. When the charge hit their battery and then retreated without infantry support or any attempt to hold ground, the Russians realized it had been a mistake. Russian accounts of the battle describe the charge with a mixture of admiration and pity. They respected the courage it took to ride through that fire, but they also recognized it was pointless. Some Russian soldiers who captured British cavalry reported that the prisoners seemed dazed, unable to explain why they'd charged. The Russians treated the captured British cavalry with respect, recognizing them as fellow professional soldiers who'd been badly led. In Russian military culture, the charge of the Light Brigade became an example of Western European military thinking, brave but irrational, valuing honor and obedience over practical outcomes. This fit Russian stereotypes about Western armies as rigid and tradition-bound. The reality, of course, is that Russian, British, French, and every other army of the era had similar problems with aristocratic leadership, unclear orders, and communication failures. The Light Brigade just happened to be the most dramatic example. Now, final analysis. What does the charge of the Light Brigade teach us? First, clarity in communication is essential. Vague orders kill people. Raglan's order was open to interpretation, and that interpretation sent men to die. Modern militaries spend enormous time and resources developing clear, unambiguous order formats specifically to avoid this kind of disaster. Second, subordinates must be able to question orders without fear. Lucan and Cardigan knew the charge was suicide, but they didn't push back hard enough because questioning orders from a superior was seen as insubordination. Modern command culture, at least in Western militaries, emphasizes that subordinates have a duty to clarify unclear orders and to refuse illegal or obviously suicidal orders. Third, personal relationships between commanders matter. The hatred between Lucan and Cardigan prevented the kind of open communication that might have caught the era. If they'd been able to work together, to discuss the order and agree it made no sense, they might have sent someone back to Raglan for clarification. Instead, they followed the order because neither wanted to give the other an opportunity to accuse them of cowardice or insubordination. Fourth, professional competence should matter more than social status. Raglan, Lucan, and Cardigan were in command because of their aristocratic backgrounds, not their military skill. In a modern professional military, none of them would have been given command positions based on their actual competence. Fifth, soldiers deserve better than to die for mistakes. The men of the Light Brigade did their duty, followed orders, showed incredible courage. They deserved commanders who valued their lives enough to question orders that made no sense. That's the tragedy of the charge. Not that men died in combat, that's the nature of war, but that they died for nothing, because their commanders failed them at every level. If this story taught you something about command failure, about the cost of unclear orders and rigid obedience, about how organizational dysfunction gets people killed, hit that like button and tell me in the comments. Tell me what you think about this disaster. Tell me if you want more stories about military failures and what they teach us. Share this video if you think others should understand what actually happened at Balaclava, not the romanticized version, but the real story of command failure and wasted courage. Subscribe if you want more history that doesn't celebrate disaster, that looks at what went wrong and why it matters. The charge of the Light Brigade happened. 670 men rode into a valley under fire from 3 sides to attack a battery they couldn't hold. 330 were killed, wounded, or captured. The charge accomplished nothing strategically. It was a disaster caused by vague orders, command dysfunction, and blind obedience. But it became legendary because Alfred Tennyson wrote a poem that turned disaster into heroism, waste into sacrifice, and command failure into a celebration of duty. That's not history, that's mythology. The real history is messier, more complicated, and more important. The real history is about how systems fail, how communication breaks down, how people making bad decisions in good faith can kill hundreds of others. The real history matters because these patterns repeat. Different wars, different weapons, different commanders, but the same fundamental failures. Unclear orders, subordinates afraid to question. Personal animosity preventing coordination. Social status valued over competence. These failures killed the Light Brigade in 1854, and they've killed thousands more in conflicts since. That's why we study this. Not to celebrate futile charges, but to understand what went wrong so we can prevent it from happening again. Thank you for watching. Remember the Light Brigade. Remember what happened to them. Remember that courage without competent leadership is wasted. Remember that following orders isn't the highest virtue if those orders are stupid. Remember that poetry and myth can obscure truth, and truth matters more. See you in the next one.